this is just an update on the Julian Assange case. In some cases, or in some instances, or some aspects of this, has gotten far more complicated. In other aspects, there is a bright spot, or at the very least, there is one bright spot, but it is a big bright spot. Let's talk about it in a soapbox. Like I said, there are aspects of this case that have gotten more complicated for Assange. And by complicated, I don't necessarily mean in a positive way. But there is one aspect of this where the U.S. has somewhat jumped the shark that I think is going to be somewhat of a positive for Assange. I am Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. And like I said, this is more so just an update on the case of, I guess you can say, the elements or the things surrounding it about what has taken place. I'm not necessarily going to belabor you on everything that's come up to this point, because if you're watching the show, you probably already know. But just as a snapshot, Assange ducks into an embassy in order to avoid what he knew was going to be U.S. extradition. Now, in ducking into this embassy in order to avoid U.S. extradition, he is there for about 7 years. After 7 years, a deal is made with Ecuador where Ecuador gets a ton of money and Ecuador gives up Assange, not to mention the political pressure that was being put on Ecuador in order to hand over Assange. But however he was handed over, Assange was handed over. Assange right now is in Belmarsh prison in the UK, and he's going through various hearings as an argument or as a fight is about to take place on issues of extradition to the United States. Initially, it was a hacking charge. That hacking charge became 17 additional charges. Now, up to this point, the media has, for the most part, hated Assange. They hated Assange because, in their mind, he helped Trump get elected. Let's be honest. They want to say that he's not a journalist, despite the fact using stories that Assange has actually put out. Not to mention, the man has gotten journalistic awards. He's a publisher of material. People give him stuff, information, whistleblowers, and he publishes that information. The media, many of these people who vilify him, has used his content in their stories. Astonishing. Here's the thing. Right now, there is a trial, or there is... Right here. Come on. Get back. There you are. Alright. So, there's an extradition hearing that's going to take place tomorrow. And there is a protest that is going to take place outside of that hearing in Westminster's Magistrates Court. They're going to arrange at 9 a.m., 5/2019. Essentially, they do the dates backwards. Essentially tomorrow, 5/30/2019. And they want to have a protest out there in order to get across their disdain that the British government is keeping Assange. That's tomorrow. There was another one that was less heard about yesterday. Now, that one that took place yesterday had to do with whether or not Assange was in health or good enough health in order to go through with the hearing that is supposed to take place for Sweden on the 3rd of June. So there are two things that are taking place right now. There's an extra hearing that's trying to take place now from the standpoint of the United States. There's another one that's taking place from the standpoint of Sweden. Both are trying to get Assange extradited. Sweden, of course, wants to get him extradited to Sweden. The United States, of course, wants to bring him back to the United States. Interesting thing about the United States one, the United States started with a hacking charge, added 17 additional charges, which ran roughshod over all notions of the First Amendment. Now, the bright spot in this, and let's go to the negative spot first. The negative spot is Sweden. Sweden's prosecutor that had closed the case has now reopened the case with the thought of trying to get Assange extradited to Sweden on what they call a rape charge. Assange ducked into the embassy all of those years ago, not because he wanted to avoid the rape charge, but because, one thing, don't extradite me to the United States. That was his only wish. Don't extradite. If you can give me assurances that you're not going to extradite me to the United States, Sweden could give no such assurances. In which case, fearing for his life, he went into the embassy. Do you believe that Sweden is going to give those assurances now that he is in captivity or in custody of Britain? He is not. Now, Britain is trying to keep him in custody for 50 weeks, meaning they charged him with avoiding bail and gave him 50 weeks. That's astonishing, but that's what they did. So now he has all of these cases that he's going to have to fight between the United States and Sweden. The argument that the Swedish defense attorney made was, look, I haven't had the opportunity to even talk with him. He hasn't necessarily been in the best of health. The judge didn't want to hear that. And the judge allowed this case to go forward on June 30th. I don't care if you were able to talk to your charge. This case is going forward. So, Sweden, June 3rd. The U.S. extradition hearing is going to take like a year, they're thinking about, because there's going to be fights back and forth. And with the 17 additional charges added, it is questionable on whether or not Britain would even extradite him in this way, under these charges. Meaning, the moment that the attorneys and the judge hears what the United States is planning with these 17 charges, it's possible that they say, yeah, we can't send him to your country because of that. Even though the extradition between the UK and the United States, you can imagine, Britain almost does this in their sleep. But we will see this creates somewhat of a precedent. Now, the Swedish part is the part that's interesting. I would argue that all of this ends back up at the United States. If the UK is not willing to do the job and send him back to the US, will Sweden do it? Sweden may do it. So the UK may say, yeah, we can't do that. However, we will send him to Sweden since this is part of the European Union. We are currently still part of the European Union. Yeah, we'll send him to Sweden. Question is, will Sweden send him to the United States? Yes. All of this ends back up at the United States. All of this, to some degree, you can argue, is the United States almost like, well, you're always in the Matrix, even when you're outside of the Matrix. Even when you're outside of the Matrix, it's like, no, the UK is not going to send them to the US, but the US has an indoor or back door with this, which is Sweden. This is Julian Assange's... Oh, there's one more catch. Britain, the political instrument, gets the final choice. So, right here, I found this extremely interesting. With Swedish prosecutors announcing they have requested a detention order against Assange last week and reopening the sexual assault case against him, the entire U.S. extradition case can be further put on hold. Extradition is not normally a political decision, but Britain's Home Secretary has the power to suggest to courts which one to prioritize. The Home Secretary can say, we're sending him to Sweden. Or they can say, we're sending him to the U.S. and prioritize this case over the other case, in which case the judicial instrument gives deference to what the political instrument is saying. Meaning, ultimately, the political instrument of the UK may get the final say-so over which extradition case gets heard first. But my argument is, this, in an overt sense, may matter less if Sweden, at the end of the day, knows that it's going to extradite him to the United States. That's the catch. That's the catch. This is Assange's attorney. Listen to her for the moment. She's been on this case for a very long time, and everything that they've said up to this point has been true. There was a warrant hiding and lurking in the back scenes. They did have every intention in the world of trying to get Assange extradited, and this is going to either be through Sweden or the United States. In this case, it's somewhat complicated in what the United States wants to do in going after journalism.
Grave threat to freedom of speech. We've been warning since 2010 that this outcome was likely. There was a criminal investigation opened by the Obama administration, aggressively now pursued by the Trump administration. But an indictment for a publisher for publishing truthful information, it's the first time in American history. And as we've seen overnight from the response from the New York Times and other free speech organisations and media organisations, this is a great concern for all journalists and publishers, both inside and outside of the US. 170 years in prison for publishing truthful information, an indictment which captures what is typical news gathering activity for investigative journalists. Journalists do this all day, every day. And so the chill that it could have both on those willing to engage in a national security context in journalism and for WikiLeaks itself is significant. What we had understood is that the Obama administration had taken a decision not to press those charges precisely because of the implications for free speech and other media organisations. You cannot distinguish between the activity of WikiLeaks and other media organisations. The Trump administration, however, seems, as we've seen today and overnight, very happy to pursue that as a precedent. And what that will mean for the rest of the media is terrifying. The documents that were published revealed evidence.
Notice what she said. Then what is the difference? What is the difference? What is the difference? Like, have you thought about that? It's almost like somebody saying, I don't know what porn is, but I know I want to see it. Like, it's hard to write that into law where you're making a distinction between one versus the other. The same thing is true here. What is the distinction between what Julian Assange and what WikiLeaks does, getting information from whistleblowers and publishing that information? The biggest difference here is media, news, is mostly stenographers. And the information that they're publishing are doing so at the behest of somebody else that wants to put that information into the public sphere, either to attack one of their political opponents, either to be this kind of just chum to avoid from other issues, or just issues, monotonous stuff that doesn't necessarily matter one way or the other. It's just news, a 24-hour news cycle. Assange's information goes towards this notion of this is what these guys are doing behind the scenes. And this is explicitly what they don't want you to know, but what you should know. That's the difference. Mainstream media are mostly stenographers. What WikiLeaks is publishing is stuff that gives you this real impression of what governments are, what they talk about behind the scenes, and what they actually do in the real world, not just this image that they want to portray. It is impossible for you to craft something that delineates what WikiLeaks is from what journalists are, because WikiLeaks is what journalists are supposed to be. Fucking A.
Evidence of war crimes, systematic wrongdoing, human rights abuse, corruption. This is information that was published in the public interest. The journalism awards that have been won, the fact that it's been published by a number of other media organisations demonstrates that fact. There are a huge amount of accusations made by the American government of the harm that was caused, and yet very little evidence, in fact no evidence, of anyone who was in particular harmed by these publications. So I think, as we saw in the Chelsea Manning proceedings, it was acknowledged that harm wasn't done, it was purely embarrassing. The Department of Justice is unable to distinguish between the actions of journalists and the actions that they allege about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange in this particular instance. What it boils down to is having conversations with sources about what information might be available and discussing that with the source and encouraging the source to give information. Journalists do this all the time. They are unable to distinguish between that, and that's why the New York Times has been concerned about it and why free speech groups are concerned about it.
Everything that woman has just said there is absolutely correct and true. Now, here's the catch. You could say, well, wait a minute, she's an attorney for Assange, she's just going to say that. But the fact of the matter is, the New York Times, Washington Post, The Intercept, all of these journalistic outlets have come out. Even Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes, meaning even MSNBC, these people who are bitter and angry at Clinton losing. Rachel Maddow, there was an interesting thing seeing Rachel Maddow do that video, because there was a tug of war in her, like, I hate him because he got Hillary losing. But God, there's information that I put out from whistleblowers. This is going to be an attack on free speech, which is the bright spot in all this. Despite two governments trying to get at Julian Assange, Sweden and the United States, the bright spot here is that journalists are on his side. As much as they hate him for getting Hillary Clinton elected, they at the very least know that what Trump doing here is like broadside. They've created this odd situation in which Trump has so jumped the shark that he's allowed, like, Julian Assange is a way of attacking Trump, which makes him this thing that they have to protect, almost in his way of protecting the First Amendment. It's a really bizarre circumstance. They're not defending Assange per se, they're defending the First Amendment. And this is where the rubber meets the road, and how you get across that this guy is a journalist. Because again, it is impossible to delineate what he does, which is journalism, with what they do, which I would say is stenographers, but what they're supposed to be doing. The bright spot here is that the American press is now on Julian Assange's side and going with the notion that Donald Trump has jumped the shark and has made a broadside attack on the First Amendment and trying to get Assange. It is unclear whether Assange would ever even get to the point of being extradited to the United States. But that said, the U.S. seems to be making an extraordinary effort, being from the standpoint of working through its lapdog Sweden or the UK. We'll see. Stay tuned. One extradition hearing is for tomorrow, and another one is going to take place on June 3rd. It is unclear, with all the turmoil that is taking place within the British government, on whether or not a choice is going to be made on which to give deference to, meaning to the courts. We'll see. My argument is that it doesn't necessarily matter which one you give deference to. Ultimately, the U.S. has its hand in both. That's my thought. I could be wrong. We'll see. It's possible that the court system in Sweden is more independent than I think it is, and it's possible that the court system in the UK is more independent than I think it is. I think we're going to find out. Either way, there's a hearing tomorrow, and like I said, there's another hearing on the 3rd for Sweden. Stay tuned. Let's see, and I think there might have been a super chat. Come on. The system is like crawling. All right. If you guys enjoyed this content, please consider sharing, liking, supporting. You can always assist through PayPal or Patreon. I could have swore I saw one. I don't want to miss it. All right. Thanks all.